Hi, I'm Margaret Maitland, Principal Curator of the Ancient Mediterranean at National Museum Scotland. First of all, I'd like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to present, especially Lisa Doyle. As an Egyptologist by training, I feel a bit of an interloper at a classics-led conference, but my hope is that I can still offer a perspective that's a bit different, but still useful. The premise of the conference asks the value of studying the ancient world, both in and out of the academy. And my talk will look at the importance of breaking down the barriers that have excluded people from participating in our understanding of and interactions with antiquity. Can we improve how we study and share heritage so that it's more relevant to society today and involves people and communities from across society and the world? I'll look at some examples of uses of the past, ancient and modern, and how this was used for colonial power in Egypt. Some of the biases in our interpretation of the past that have arisen from this context. The working class contributions that have gone unacknowledged because of this. And some things that museums and community work are doing to try to help change this. The study of the past can inspire and inform our understanding of the world, but it is also often being used to exclude and to control, to exert power and perpetuate unequal systems. Even in antiquity, the past was used to exert power. For example, in ancient Egypt, kings presented themselves before long lists naming their glorious predecessors in order to present themselves as the legitimate inheritors of the divine right to rule. Shown here, Seti I and the future Ramses II actually came from a non-royal military family. And of course, the list censors less conventional and controversial rulers, excluding them from this list. Thousands of years later, Egypt's past was co-opted as a source of power by Europe. While Egyptian scholars had had an interest in their history and the ancient monuments that surrounded them throughout the medieval and Islamic periods, it was only really around the turn of the 19th century that European interests in Egypt's antiquities began in earnest, with the scholarly expedition that accompanied Napoleon as justification for his invasion of Egypt. France and Britain were both colonizing nations with an interest in Egypt's strategic position between Europe and Asia, especially as part of the route to India. European military and scholarly expeditions laid claim to Egypt's monuments, whose extreme ancientness became a source of prestige, particularly in achieving scholarly authority and understanding them. Initially, Egyptian antiquities were seen as curiosities, but the impressive monuments were quickly absorbed into an idea of Western civilization, alongside Greece and Rome, disconnecting ancient Egypt from Africa and from modern Egypt. Collecting was framed in terms of scientific study and the protection of endangered antiquities, often presented as needing protection from the modern Egyptians who lived and worked alongside them, but whose presence was now seen as contaminating an idealized ancient past. Despite declarations that European collections, the Egyptian collections in universal museums were there for all of humanity, it was generally European and American scholars and audiences that benefited, and Egyptians were intentionally excluded. For example, the jealously controlling French head of the Antiquities Service in Egypt, Auguste Mariette, refused to appoint any of the Egyptians who attended the first school of Egyptology in Egypt set up in 1869, like the great Ahmed Kamal, who still managed to go on to a great career, but was initially excluded. Subsequently, Mariette flat out banned Egyptians from being able to study hieroglyphic inscriptions in the museum in Cairo. Later, in 1903, when Egypt was under British control, Cairo museum policy was changed and an admission fee was instituted specifically to prevent swarms of the unwashed streaming in. Unfortunately, the disciplines, colonial histories and legacies are rarely taught as part of Egyptological studies, but we must confront them if we're to stop perpetuating unjust systems of exclusion and reveal how colonialist, elitist, and sexist biases have distorted our understanding of the past. To share one example of this, the Qurna Burial group is an incredibly rich, intact burial assemblage of a woman and child, now part of the collections of National Museum Scotland. The woman's ethnic identity in particular has been a focus of discussion, centering around whether she was Egyptian or Nubian, meaning from ancient Sudan. Although the overall style of the burial was Egyptian, several items were identifiable as Nubian. Most prominently, these finely made Nubian beakers. In the past, these have been used by scholars to argue that the woman was probably a Nubian princess who had been brought to Egypt for the purposes of a diplomatic marriage. However, this interpretation is problematic in framing Nubia as culturally and politically subservient to Egypt, and it removes any agency in the selection of burial goods, framing them as purely a function of the woman's ethnicity, rather than seeking to understand how they may have been used to construct and project her identity and status. While Mycenaean, Greek, and Cypriot vessels excavated in Egyptian-style graves have generally been seen as imports, Nubian pottery and Egyptian burials have not, revealing a reluctance to recognize the desirability of Nubian material culture, rooted in Egyptological and colonial bias against Africa. There is no reason to assume Nubian material culture should be seen as inferior, or even that it would have been seen as such by the ancient Egyptians. In the early 20th century, excavations of the Nubian Kingdom of Kerma found Egyptian objects that were interpreted as evidence that it was an Egyptian colony. But this interpretation has subsequently been shown to be rooted in a colonialist bias, as later excavations by Charles Bonnet and Dominique Valbel revealed extensive, elaborate indigenous Nubian structures and demonstrated the scale and wealth of their capital city. Considering the undeniable aesthetic appeal and fine quality of the Kerma beakers, it seems entirely likely that they fostered a desirability amongst elite Egyptian audiences as luxury imports. Other items in the Qurna burial have generally been assumed to be Egyptian, but elements of their design, such as the triangular design on this headrest, clearly show contemporary Nubian influence, and may also link back to an older shared cultural heritage across the Nile Valley. The desire of scholars and museums to categorize objects and people, to present one as superior to another, has often blinded us to ancient perspectives and cultural commonalities. Objects like these have been used by museums to teach the public that cultures could be divided into those that were civilized and those that were primitive, and notions of civilization were bound up with kingship, wealth, and conquest. One of my predecessors, the renowned Egyptologist Cyril Aldred, commissioned a series of dioramas that reconstructed idealized visions of ancient Egypt. These drew heavily on ancient Egyptian art, so they were considered very accurate in one sense, but they also ended up reproducing many of the biases present in the ancient Egyptian elite worldview, as well as British worldview as well. In the dioramas, the king is presented as central, the essential head of a natural and necessary social hierarchy. Aldred told the artists that the laborers should be shown burnt dark by the sun and more undernourished than their overlords. In the diorama of an ancient Egyptian fort in Nubia, Nubians are almost completely absent, and Aldridge used the display to praise Egyptians as the first to open up tropical Africa to civilized contact. Visitors were encouraged to be awed by the wealth and power of an extremely unequal society and its empire building, as well as the museums that had claimed these treasures. But is this really what we want to value? Should it really be pyramids over people? As another example from my PhD research, I focused on how non-elite people were represented in elite Egyptian culture. I'd been quite surprised to find that while there were numerous studies examining elite self-presentation and the construction of elite identity, there had been very little discussion of how the elite depicted the rest of society, how they used negative stereotypes to construct distinctions between themselves and the non-elite, and how these representations may have shaped ancient Egyptian society. I was particularly surprised to find that not only had scholars mostly ignored any systematic study of the laborers presented in elite tomb decoration, but that some publications had actually distorted how they were recorded, simplifying figures to the point of inaccuracy, so that all of the laborers were shown standardized and interchangeable, actually altering data to make the divisions in ancient Egyptian society even more extreme. These ideas have seeped through into how children are taught in schools, using an exaggerated version of ancient Egypt to justify inequality. For example, this lesson plan that promotes the value of different roles in society, from kings to slaves. Since so much early scholarship forms the foundations of our understanding of the past, it is vital that we approach this with a critical eye. And often, valuable new perspectives are provided by those who come from outside the discipline. This is certainly the case with the figure at the center of my current research, funded by a Headley Fellowship from Art Fund. In the mid-19th century, Alexander Henry Rind was one of the first pioneers of archaeology in Scotland, and he went on to be one of the first, the first experienced archaeologist to work in Egypt. His attitudes towards material culture had been shaped by his experience of more modest prehistoric objects and sites in Scotland. As such, Rind took an interest in simple objects and ordinary people that was not always shared by his peers, who were more concerned with monuments, inscriptions, and treasures. Rind was able to devote his time to archaeology because he was independently wealthy, but archaeologists have never worked alone. If one scratches the surface, one can find the overlooked and unacknowledged contributions of working class Scots and Egyptians who did much more than provide labor. When Rind went to Egypt in the 1850s, like other European collectors and archaeologists, he was reliant on local assistance. At the necropolis at Thebes, generations of Egyptian excavators from the village of Qurna worked over many decades with countless collectors and archaeologists who came and went. Accordingly, the Qurnawi became specialists in excavations, as well as understanding of sites and objects, but their contributions were downplayed from the start by Europeans who played up Orientalist stereotypes of indolence and untrustworthiness. Nevertheless, Rind recognized them as experienced and expert investigators. It is difficult, but not impossible, to trace their influence in the archaeological record. When I first read Rind's work, I was impressed by his relatively astute analysis of changes in Egyptian burial practice over time. This achievement becomes clearer in the context of his brief acknowledgement that he drew on the imperfect crumbs of intelligence to be gleaned from the more experienced excavating fellaheen. So clearly, the Qurnawi's extensive knowledge helped provide Rind with the comparative information he needed to make sense of what they were excavating. The Qurnawi worked as excavators for hire, but over time, as officially sanctioned archaeological excavations were increasingly framed as the only legitimate form of engagement with antiquities, the Qurnawi were marginalized, discredited, and vilified as tomb robbers. This convenient slander undermined not only their expertise, but also any claims that they had to the antiquities, the land itself, or any say in decisions about them. In 1890, the American collector Charles Edwin Wilbur wrote about sitting and reminiscing about the old times with several venerable Qurnawi, included Muhammad Abdul Rasul, pictured here. But what stories they told are not recorded. What knowledge and perspectives were lost because they were not allowed to speak for themselves? How would Egyptian archaeology have developed had they been treated as collaborators and equals? To offer another example from outside of Egypt, I was intrigued by a group of objects in National Museum Scotland's collections from Iron Age burials in northern Greece. In the 1920s, these objects had inspired a British Museum archaeologist to excavate the site where they had been found as part of the first systematic excavations of prehistory in northern Greece. But how had these objects been discovered and come to the museum in Edinburgh, along with detailed recordings of where the items had been found in the graves? Digging through archives revealed that they were donated by an Edinburgh man named Robert Gaddy, who had served in Greece during World War I, supporting troops with the YMCA. It seems that his interest in archaeology may have been sparked by visits to the museum, which was just a few steps away from where he lived and worked. It took a working class amateur archaeologist to see the value in objects like these that had previously been overlooked by classicists. It's one of the legacies that museums need to deal with today, the absence of people and stories who haven't been valued. In particular in Egyptology, a discipline which technically should mean the study of anything Egyptian, but it has instead only focused on the ancient. This is meant to disconnect between ancient Egypt and Egypt today, in which ancient Egypt was appropriated as Western and became something that exists only in European museums. When I was given the opportunity to lead the development of a new ancient Egyptian gallery at the National Museum of Scotland, I wanted to try to reframe focus on Egyptian people and their lived experiences, to address collecting histories, and to redress the disconnect between ancient Egypt and modern Egypt. In the new gallery, we've tried to address some of the complex histories behind how the collection came to Edinburgh through colonial contexts, such as this coffin gifted by the Egyptian government under diplomatic pressure to the Prince of Wales in 1867, through to purchases that dispersed fragments of monuments like this to museums around the world. We used large-scale photographs and AV with an Egyptian narrator to situate the collections in the context of Egypt's living landscapes, to show that the ancient monuments are still part of contemporary Egyptians' lives today. One of our digital films shares the contemporary festival of Luxor's Muslim patron saint, Sheikh Abdul Hagag, that continues traditions that date all the way back to the ancient Egyptian festival of Opet. We also acknowledge Egyptian contributions and feature Egyptian Egyptologists as authoritative voices in our films, including Dr. Fatma Keshk, who highlights the importance of work that she and others are doing today to involve local Egyptian communities in archaeology through outreach activities, and to learn from them about what they value in terms of their own heritage. Over the past year, National Museum Scotland has been a partner in the AHRC-funded project Egypt's Dispersed Heritage, led by the brilliant Alice Stevenson and Heba Abdul-Wahd, which explores the legacies of British archaeology in Egypt and creates opportunities for dialogue around this history. At the beginning of the project, we hosted a public discussion, which is now available online as a podcast on our project website, which we've also made available in colloquial Egyptian Arabic. We also worked with Heba Abdul-Wahd to share collections and collecting histories with contemporary Egyptian communities through online discussions in which project participants shared their personal responses to objects and created their own new labels, bringing a uniquely Egyptian sensibility to how they saw the objects. For example, comparing this statue to the famous and beloved Egyptian singer Kulthum. Heba has also involved us in some of her fantastically creative and thought-provoking collaborations with the Egyptian cartoonist Nasser Jr., which produced a series of comics addressed at Egyptian audiences, including this one featuring a statue of a chief of police and his wife, excavated in 1857 and now in National Museum Scotland's collections. The comic riffs on the response to COVID-19 in reference to the isolation of ancient Egyptian objects in museums from modern Egyptian communities. In this and in many other ways, as Heba has said so eloquently, the project is amplifying the voices, visibility, and validity of modern Egyptian communities and reclaiming ancient Egypt as Egyptian. To sum up, those of us who are privileged enough to be able to study the past cannot keep this to ourselves. We have a responsibility to share access, knowledge, and platforms, to push research beyond colonial and elitist confines, and to address issues that are relevant to people today, so that the lessons of the past can help inform how we want to create the society that we want to see in the future. There's so much more work that needs to be done, but it's promising to see so many colleagues trying to tackle these issues. There's too many to mention here, but if you'd like more inspiration, check out some of these inspirations, some of these recommendations here. Thank you so much for your attention.